The American Civil War did not begin with two armies facing each other across a field. It began in the dark, over water, with a shell rising from a mortar battery and bursting above a half-finished brick fort in Charleston Harbor. That fort was Fort Sumter. And the strange thing about Fort Sumter is this: almost nobody died in the bombardment itself. No great charge. No line of infantry disappearing into smoke. No wheat field, no stone wall, no ridge held until sunset. But when the first Confederate mortar shell went up at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, the argument was over. The country had crossed from crisis into war. To understand why, start with the harbor. Charleston was not just another southern city. It was the cradle of secession. South Carolina had left the Union on December 20th, 1860, after Abraham Lincoln's election. By February, 6 more Deep South states had followed. A Confederate government had formed at Montgomery. Federal forts, arsenals, and custom houses across the South were being seized or demanded. But inside Charleston Harbor, a United States flag still flew. Major Robert Anderson, a Kentucky-born U.S. Army officer, commanded a small federal garrison in Charleston. His original post was Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, an old coastal fort whose guns faced the sea. It was built to stop foreign ships, not a landward assault from South Carolina militia. So on the night of December 26, 1860, Anderson made the move that turned a local standoff into a national symbol. He spiked Moultrie's guns, burned the gun carriages, and moved his men across the harbor into Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was stronger, but it was not ready. It sat on a man-made island near the harbor entrance, built from stone and brick as part of America's coastal defense system. It was designed for hundreds of men and more than 100 guns. Anderson had roughly 80 to 90 soldiers, limited supplies, and a fort still under construction. To Washington, Fort Sumter was federal property. To South Carolina, it was a foreign garrison in the middle of an independent harbor. To the new Confederacy, it was a test. Could a government call itself sovereign while the old flag still flew over Charleston? Fort Sumter mattered because it forced both sides into a corner. Lincoln could not abandon it without making secession look successful. The Confederacy could not tolerate it without looking like a government that did not control its own front door. The first attempt to relieve the fort came before Lincoln even took office. In January 1861, the Star of the West sailed toward Charleston with provisions and reinforcements. Cadets and shore batteries fired on her. She turned back. That failure left Anderson isolated. By March, Jefferson Davis had ordered P.G.T. Beauregard to take command of Confederate forces at Charleston. Beauregard knew Anderson personally. He had been Anderson's artillery student at West Point. Now, the student commanded the guns around the teacher. The geography was brutal. Confederate batteries ringed the harbor. Fort Moultrie, Cummings Point, Morris Island, Fort Johnson, floating batteries, mortars, cannon. NPS notes that several dozen Confederate guns and mortars could bear on Sumter. Anderson had guns inside the fort, but not enough men to work them all, and too few cartridges to sustain a long fight. His real enemy was not just artillery, it was hunger. Lincoln's decision was careful and dangerous. He would not send a major reinforcement unless attacked. He would send provisions, food, supplies, enough to keep the garrison alive and the flag flying. That sounds restrained. It was also a political trap. If the Confederates allowed the supplies in, Fort Sumter remained Union. If they fired first, they would begin the war. If Lincoln abandoned the fort, he would signal that secession could win by pressure alone. There was no neutral move left. On April 10th, Confederate Secretary of War Leroy Walker instructed Beauregard to demand the evacuation of Fort Sumter once Lincoln's resupply effort was confirmed. If Anderson refused, Beauregard was to reduce the fort. The demand came on April 11th. Anderson refused, courteously but firmly. He could not comply with honor or with his obligations to the government he served. Then he added the fact everyone knew. Unless relieved, he would have to leave within days anyway. That should have offered a way out. Wait a few days. Let hunger do what artillery did not have to do. But the Confederate government was not trying merely to remove Anderson. It was trying to prevent the arrival of Lincoln's supplies. Waiting until April 15th might mean the fleet appeared in the harbor and the Confederacy lost the initiative. After midnight, Beauregard's envoys returned with a final proposal. Anderson could name the hour he would evacuate, provided he promised not to fire unless fired upon. Anderson said noon on Monday, April 15th, unless he was resupplied. That was not enough. At 3:20 in the morning, the Confederate officers left Fort Sumter and told Anderson the bombardment would begin in 1 hour. At 4:30 a.m., from Fort Johnson, a 10-inch mortar fired the signal shot. The shell arced over the harbor and burst above Fort Sumter. Charleston woke up to watch the beginning of the war. Within half an hour, Confederate batteries around the harbor were firing. Anderson kept his men under cover at first. He had limited powder and cartridges. He also chose not to use the exposed barbette guns on the top tier because shell fragments made them too dangerous. That meant many of Sumter's heaviest guns stayed silent. Around 7 a.m., the Union response began. Captain Abner Doubleday fired at the iron battery on Cummings Point. The shot struck accurately enough, but bounced off. That was the character of the fight: loud, symbolic, unequal. For more than a day, the fort endured. Anderson organized his men in reliefs. They worked the guns, made cartridges from cloth, and tried to keep the response going. The Confederates had numbers, position, and ammunition. The Union garrison had discipline and a flag. By the second day, hot shot from Fort Moultrie set the wooden quarters inside Fort Sumter on fire. Smoke filled the casemates. The powder magazine became a danger. Officers moved what powder they could, then closed the magazine and covered it with dirt. Men lay on the floor with wet cloths over their faces. Then the flagstaff was shot away. That is the image to hold. Not a shattered army, but a flag falling into smoke. The military result was already obvious. The political result was just beginning. When Confederate observers saw the flag fall, some thought the fort was surrendering. Former U.S. Senator Louis Wigfall rode out from Morris Island and pushed his way into the fort. The surrender process was confused, but the essential fact was clear. Anderson could not keep fighting. At about 2:30 p.m. on April 13th, he agreed to surrender. The terms allowed him and his men to leave with honor. They could take their flag. They could fire a salute. They would be transported north. The bombardment itself had killed no one on either side. Then, during the salute, a gun exploded. Private Daniel Howe was killed. Another soldier was mortally wounded. Fort Sumter's first blood came after the firing was supposed to be finished. The military scale was small. The consequences were enormous. Anderson and his men were greeted as heroes in the North. Beauregard was celebrated in the South. Lincoln called for volunteers. More states would be pulled into the conflict. The argument over secession, federal authority, slavery's expansion, and the future shape of the Republic had become a war. Fort Sumter remained in Confederate hands for most of that war. The Union would come back to Charleston Harbor in 1863 and pound the fort into ruins. It would not be recovered until 1865, when Confederate forces evacuated Charleston. But the first act had already done its work. Fort Sumter was the battle with almost no battle deaths that started the bloodiest war in American history. That is not a contradiction. It is the point. Sometimes the decisive shot is not the one that kills the most men. It is the one that makes retreat impossible. So Episode 1 begins here. A harbor, a fort, a flag, and two governments that could not both be real in the same place. The Civil War did not start because a fort was militarily priceless. It started because Fort Sumter made the question visible. Who was sovereign in Charleston Harbor? The United States answered by holding the fort. The Confederacy answered by firing on it. And once that answer came out of the mortar at Fort Johnson, the rest of the country had to answer too.